Hi everyone, I'm Raj Kumar, President and Editor-in-Chief of DevX. This week we'll be breaking down the big headlines in global development and bringing in some top experts to help us do it. If you want to follow along with the stories we're talking about, check out devx.com and subscribe to our daily newsletter, The Newswire. There's a link in the description. Follow us along on Twitter and you can see many of the stories we're talking about today, and we'd love to hear what you think. This is This Week in Global Development.
Well, hello and welcome to another episode of This Week in Global Development, the weekly podcast where we talk about all things global dev in the headlines. This week, as always, lots to talk about. And I'm joined by David Ainsworth, our business editor. Hey, Dave.
Hey, how you doing, Raj?
Good to have you here. And we've got a returning guest in Nasra Ismail. Hi, Nasra.
Hi, Raj. Hi, David. Good to be here.
Great to have you here. Of course, Nasra is the executive director for Alight and a leader in the development and the humanitarian space. So we love getting your perspective on all the stories this week. And this week, we're mercifully taking a little bit of a break from all the US and UK and French and other election coverage and talking about some other stories that I think are really topical and timely for the global development community. We had one that I thought we could just start on, Dave. You want to tell people about the Humanitarian cowboy story written by our colleague Lauren Evans?
Yes, certainly, Raj. So this is a story that we've been thinking about for a while, based on some comments that have come to us from a couple of people in the space, and it's about how there are changes in how the humanitarian sector is doing business. And historically, I think it's fair to say the humanitarian sector has had a bit of a white savior complex. There's been this idea, this kind of grizzled, elderly white man who's kind of been to every conflict space in all over the global south for the last 20 years, has worked everywhere, done everything, and when there's a disaster, you fly this guy in and he takes charge and he starts handing out aid. And with the kind of localization movement, the grand bargain, things like this, what we're seeing very much is pushback against this. People saying, no, we think that the experts who should be in charge of delivering aid in a country are experts in the local situation. The people who live there, who understand the context, who understand how things work, the logistics, all these sort of things. Do we really need the humanitarian cowboy anymore to kind of ride in on their white horse and kind of save the day? And we spoke to quite a few people about how they feel about this. And there was, interestingly, a little bit of pushback from people who were saying, well, yeah, this is true, but there is still a little bit of a space for that kind of humanitarian cowboy. There's a couple of things that they're really useful for. And to mix our metaphors, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to this sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that was one of the best parts of the piece, right? That as often the best stories are a little bit nuanced, and there's some really interesting nuance in the piece. Nasra, I'd love to get your take because you used to lead the Somalia NGO consortium, a place you spent a lot of time, and doing a lot of humanitarian relief, local organizations doing humanitarian relief. You were also the country director for Oxfam there. So you've seen the humanitarian response work up front. What do you think about this idea of humanitarian cowboys and sort of, does it have a place or is it just a relic of the past?
Yeah, no, I appreciated this. I was smiling all throughout and kind of chuckling, thinking about memories of what it was like to run into some of these folks who have this profile and have a particular personality. So I think they've always existed. I don't think we'll always find ourselves, especially as more conflict and more crises increase, this trend. Maybe it's not a significant trend, but I would say I have seen a fair share of these folks in my career, particularly when I was co-located in places that were, in conflict or particularly post-conflict. They're cowgirls and cowboys, and I think, it's very similar. Just to humanize them, it's very similar to what we see in journalists who cover conflict. That sense of adrenaline, that sense of excitement, these high stakes conflicts in places that people are reporting on, are living in, are trying to do response and support humanity that's in those difficult spaces. So I think there's a reason for where they come from and what kind of environments give way to them. But Raj, yeah, I feel like maybe not on the podcast, but I have so many stories of these personalities that I ran into Some of them were American, some of them were European. A lot of them had military or perhaps had served in some capacity before. So I think there is a sense of heroism that you see in folks. One of the things that's brilliant, and I think that is perhaps why we're not seeing so many of them, is all the reforms in the sector, the need to listen to communities, these sort of soft skills that require a different kind of engagement with our local actors, our local constituents and stakeholders. And so there's different skill sets required and not just a sense of heroism, come and solve something and leave. I know the UN also has a particular issue with attracting these kinds of personalities, but I think the sector and the reforms are requiring a different set of skills, deeper ones,
Yeah.
which are difficult.
It's interesting how you mentioned like the analogy to journalists, because you're right. One of the things the piece talks about is there was a sense, maybe there still is a sense, that if you're willing to take personal risk,
Mm,
that brings a lot of credibility. And I think the
yeah.
same thing applies when it comes to like war correspondents, right? They are lauded among journalists because of the sense like they're going to go there and put their own lives at risk to get the
Mm,
story. And it's an interesting, nuanced take that you see in the piece, because on the one hand, you could applaud that understandably, that, hey, someone's willing to go and put their own life at risk. On the other hand, I guess it could lead to an approach to humanitarian work which is not really cognizant of the realities of local people, right? If it's really all about the hero coming in and not about the people who are already there, living there, don't really have a choice, but could be the real solution, could be resourced to actually respond, then maybe you're taking away from the potential that
yeah.
exists in that community. So it is kind of a complex and nuanced picture, but I get your point that there is something in the culture in the humanitarian community, even today, some of the people quoted in the piece say, where a willingness to put your own life at risk brings with it a lot of credibility. And maybe that's somewhat separate from whether it's the right thing to do from a humanitarian
Mm.
standpoint.
Yeah, and we have all these I'm glad you mentioned culture and I'm glad you mentioned well, I would add to that leadership as well. The more we fall for some of these I think natural ways that people do respond and do take initiative and go somewhere where not many would go, it also limits the ability for the entire sector to benefit from all other types of human trends. And also, if we want inclusive communities and inclusive and decentralized leadership making, we've got to go beyond more than just creating spaces for these kind of personalities to thrive. So I think it does bring long-term bad habits and bad leadership and really not so great culture when we want to be inclusive. And we want people who are predisposed not to a sense of heroism, but predisposed to wanting to work with community and actually having a bias that community has a solution. And through curiosity and listening and other skills that bring that out. This is one of the other things that I noticed when I was particularly in the field. And when I say the field, I really mean one or two countries. When I was particularly inside Somalia, which was still reeling from conflict, all kinds of complex dynamics around conflict, we did get all these statements that reaffirmed a little bit of our beliefs. If you can make it in Somalia, you can make it anywhere. Which is a really bad way of acting in the humanitarian sector. Somalia is not the same as Afghanistan. It's not the same as South Sudan. It's not the same as all the other countries that could be in a similar political and post-conflict condition. So one of the things I've been reflecting on is, a more inclusive way requires better recruitment practices and better recruitment practices to understand what motivates people to go to these places. It's not just a sense of heroism. This is really service work. This is community work. This is good policy work, and we ought to benefit from very different mindsets.
Hi, I had a question actually, Nasra. Sorry, we're joined by my dog as well, who also has strong opinions.
He was very excited by the conversation. Yes,
He's ready to go on his next humanitarian mission.
He does have. He's got unusually strong views for a dog on this kind of thing. There were two things in the piece that that struck me as really interesting, kind of defenses of the need for the humanitarian cowboy. And I was really, Nasra, I wondered if I could ask you a couple of questions and see whether you agreed with them. One was that humanitarian work is a skill, and that you need people who do it for a living and are specialists, and particularly when disaster strikes in an area that's been peaceful, you need to fly in somebody from outside who's got those skills, and that often means flying in someone from Europe or America. And that seemed like an interesting and plausible argument to me, but not necessarily one that was true, but one that could be. And then the other one was this idea that outside observers coming from Europe and America created a sense of kind of accountability, that they had a kind of power and neutrality that you couldn't get with local workers, and that the mere fact that they were outsiders brought something to the table. How do you think that's right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a balance. I think I've always learned so much from folks who, balanced as a personal from my own personal background. When I was in Somalia and I could see both the environment confirmed, but even my own work outside of the Somalia be useful, and I can contribute to the humanitarian efforts in my own country where I do have a personal connection. But seeing what I brought from working in other sector was hugely helpful and was identified as something that was very positive. Even for someone like me who's a diaspora, that was really important. And I would imagine for people who may not have a personal connection to places that are in urgent need of humanitarian support and urgent need of good ideas wherever they're from. That is something that our sector is always going to need as it evolves, as it becomes complex. So I don't know if it's an either or, but I would say it's really the quality of people and quality of the contribution and the quality of the ideas that balance what is good and is already available in a community, so that we can make those skill sets come to fruition, so we understand how to read power dynamics internally, and we can add and contribute very well to how we solve these issues. So I don't know if it's an insider outsider. I don't know if it's someone who's from the community and someone who's from outside the community. As long as we're evolving and going towards good contribution of solving these issues, I think that's probably where I am. But I've been in many places where some insiders got it wrong and some outsiders got it wrong, but ultimately it's been a bad culture and an environment that allowed that.
Yeah, I thought, Lars Peter Nissen, who's a friend of mine, and he's quoted in the piece, he's the humanitarian leader. He, he's himself kind of a former humanitarian cowboy, so he sees this from different perspectives now leading, the biggest humanitarian think tank. And I thought his points were fascinating because he talks about how if there is a big emergency, you are going to have international response. I mean, that's certainly something the humanitarian community wants, even if it wants to see much more local work and local resourcing. If there's a big emergency, you kind of need the world to come together and say, here, we're here to support with whatever we have. And if you're dealing with suddenly all of these, acronym UN agencies and NGOs, they're all descending, you sort of need people who have relationships with these places, who know how to navigate them, who understand the international bureaucracies and reform, regulatory regimes and everything else that's at play, and ideally have spent some time with these people so you sort of have some trust or some quick trust you can create. And so maybe there really is a role, and I thought that was a compelling point that he made, that maybe we're on the pendulum, we're like way too far away from local at this point. Much more resourcing needs to go local, but that there still is a role. And you do want to have this nuanced conversation about where the international community needs to play a role and needs to even lead. It gets to what you were just asking about, David, as well. And I think it's a fascinating question. We very often, in our own coverage of localization, it's really easy to see these things in very black and white terms. But something in the middle is kind of interesting. And that goes to your point about being a member of the Somali diaspora, Nasser. Like, that's a really interesting group of people that can be drawn upon. The piece talks a lot about sort of the traditional sort of white American or European man, but you started out saying, well, there's cowboys and cowgirls, and you could be someone who comes from the diaspora, either from that country or from that region, has international experience, maybe in these international humanitarian organizations directly, but also knows the context, the language, the culture. I think maybe there's an evolve, like a humanitarian cowboy 2.0 that we can consider.
I hope so too. Even, no matter what we call them, we are all headed to just, more complex environments that are just difficult for locals, for internationals, for people who find themselves in the middle. And so I think the complexity of the work is requiring something new out of all of us, and the evolution of who is drawn to this work and how different types of people and personalities and different types of skill set thrive and how others are not thriving. I mean, that's what we're dealing with at the leadership level. I would say I'm started to see more and more, even here as I'm shifting my work from more international to the US. We can't afford to work in silos anymore. And we also can't afford to work with people just like us. Proximity looks different here within the States. Inclusivity looks different here within, the sector that I'm in now, more refugee immigration work, which is, heavily politicized. But the point is, and as much as people would say it's Pollyannish, the point is we need all hands on deck. We really, truly, in this era that we are in, where much of our institutions are suffering, there's very little trust in leadership anymore post-pandemic. There are all these elections that are taking place. We are in such dire need for diverse teams, diverse skill set, diverse mindsets that help us all get to the real cause of why we're here.
Are you looking for the inside story on what's happening at organisations like the World Bank, USAID or the Gates Foundation? Then you need to be reading DevEx Pro. I'm Jessica Abrahams and I'm the editor of DevEx Pro. Pro is DevEx's premium news subscription, where our expert reporters and analysts take you beyond the headlines, deep into the trends and institutions shaping the $200 billion aid industry. As well as all our news, you'll get access to conversations with global development leaders, resources to help you grow in your career, and a subscriber-only newsletter full of insider news and tidbits. See for yourself by getting a free trial today at devex.com/pro.
There's a piece coming out, I guess next week, and it's coming out for a special reason, which is Pro Week is coming up. If you're not familiar with DevEx Pro, that's our premium news subscription that really kind of puts you in the know. It's really meant for kind of insiders in the development community. And David Ainsworth is somebody who leads that effort at DevEx. It's great to have you here to talk about it a little bit. Tell us a little bit about Pro Week quickly, but then let's pivot into this story that people should be aware of that talks about kind of the evolution of untied aid, where it is now.
Yeah, thanks, Raj. So, first of all, to run people through Pro Week, what we've done is we've talked to our Pro subscribers, and we have several thousand of them now. It's quite a fast-growing group. A lot of people are joining us and becoming Pro members, making sure they can access all of our content. And we kind of, in our conversations with them, we identified a few themes that they were particularly interested in. And so we're really centering a whole week of content just around those pros, our premium members, and talking about the things that they've told us they want to know more about. One of those is elections. Another one is about AI. A third one is about where does the INGO go, the future of the INGO. Connected to that is localization. And then, of course, something that I think all development workers are interested in is funding. Where is the money coming from and where is it going to? And as part of that focus on funding, one of the things that we've been looking at is the concept of tied aid and the extent to which countries still fund their own NGOs. And this is kind of connected to this localization issue as well, and indeed to the future of the INGO. It touches a number of themes from the week. But a while ago, a report was published saying that still the vast majority of global North funding goes to INGOs based in the global North, and asking kind of why this continued to be the case. And we tried to dig into this a bit more and try and understand what was happening here, what were the driving factors behind this continued kind of tendency to fund your own NGOs. And obviously a few years ago, it was very common for aid to be formally tied. People would say, we're going to give you this money, but you can only really spend it with our institutions, with our companies. If it's Britain giving you aid, you have to spend it with British organizations and British people. And that's kind of a thing of the past for the most part now. But still, there are a lot of situations where effectively aid remains tied. You can only really access that aid if you are from the country that's giving it out, or you have very close links with organizations that are there. And
there's a sense that, like, aid was tied. There was a big campaign to untie it. It got legally, formally untied in many cases. But I think what you're saying, David, is de facto, it's still tied because there's all these, rules and regulations set up to kind of thwart, especially, global South organizations from being able to access this money.
Yeah, and that comes in a number of forms. Sometimes it's very explicit, like in Belgium, for example. You have to have, I'm going to murder the French word here, but an assise sociétale, a relationship with Belgium in some way in order to access Belgian aid money. Like it's explicit. You have to have a Belgian connection or we're not going to give you any cash. In the UK, it's much more kind of just a sort of handshake deal. Obviously, anyone can apply for this money. But of course, if you happen to speak English and you happen to know your way around Whitehall and you happen to know when the funding is coming out and you happen to be familiar with the forms, it's possible you might have an advantage when you're applying for this cash.
That reminds me, David, of maybe old information. One of our listeners can let us know if this is still the case, but I remember years ago, the Japanese government untied a lot of its aid as part of this Paris Declaration, this agreement among OECD countries. And then one of the ways that they did it was they would put up in a Japanese embassy or consulate in Japanese a piece of paper on the bulletin board listing a procurement opportunity. And, if you happen to be able to access that embassy, you could be inside, you knew how to read Japanese, you might know that this opportunity was coming out. But, it was a good example, I think, of legally untying, but de facto keeping it tied.
Yeah. And what surprised us a little bit was the extent to which Northern NGOs were kind of not unapologetic about this, but very defensive of this mechanism. Very much kind of saying, no, this is a good thing. We think this is quite a nice way to do business. This is probably how we should all carry on. Because what's happening here is that we're in the know with the government. We've got these close connections. We can easily access the money, and then we can pass it on to partners in the global South. And this is actually a very effective and efficient way of getting money to people in the South. And it's safe to say not everyone in the South was entirely impressed with this argument. And there was potentially a feeling that, yeah, you would say that, but actually maybe just give us the money yourselves and get out of the way. It's
a great debate to have.
Yeah, and I can see the argument of some of the Northern NGOs, and obviously we're talking to the handful of individuals who've chosen to take issue with this and therefore obviously disagree with it. And it may be that there are other Southern NGOs that are saying, no, this is quite a good mechanism. Like you get the cash and you hand it to us and we don't have to deal with all this red tape in your country, which we don't understand. But I don't know the extent to which that's the case, but it's a really interesting kind of.
Well, that's why you work with a lot of local NGOs in Somalia and elsewhere. I mean, what's your sense?
And yeah, and also donors, and particularly, small donors who, really did have a difficult time, let's say, around, understanding the needs of local NGOs and then figuring out what modality their money and resources would take. So I think I'm almost not surprised that might be a current shift. We meaning sort of folks in the global South, advancing localization, asking for better accountability of both donor, international NGO, and local NGO and government. We've seen that trend, that there were more global North INGOs tied to their government. And that actually the discussions at the local level were, is this strategic money that helps the country not only say, on the most public stage, we are doing good work. We are, investing in health and climate and education, but also perhaps not visible to a lot of media and visible to a lot of people. It was also a way to direct this strategic political interest. So I think if this is more of we're doubling down on what we have been doing before, but we're doing it more publicly, I think that should help elevate conversations around accountability so that we can have a discussion about, is this money tied to just the recipient, or is it tied to interest at the country level and political interest as well? So, the jury's not out, but this is not something I'm surprised by. I think where there might be some good discussion and good debate at the recipient level, especially countries of the global south, is what are they willing to do? And how does this shape their thinking on supporting local civil society and local NGOs and implementers, which have often relied so heavily on foreign investment and foreign donors? So I think, it's particularly in places where we are seeing severe climate issues come back and not a lot of financing available at the continental or regional level, whose responsibility is it to support local civil society, especially as we get more and more interest in climate and democracy and the state of well-being when it comes to the planet?
Yeah, I think sometimes what this conversation lacks in the development community is just the acknowledgement that there are multiple objectives for aid. Of course, in the development community, usually the predominant objective is to actually deliver impact and results, long-term development. But that's not the only objective by global North governments. And I remember being in Busan for one of these big OECD gatherings, the Busan Agreement, what was it, more than a decade ago now, where they were talking about a lot of these issues, including untied aid. And Hillary Clinton got up and gave a speech. She was Secretary of State at the time, and said, let's remember that there is a domestic political constituency. And if we go too far away from what that domestic political constituency wants, we might undermine the case for funding this stuff at all. And, I think she sort of just pointed at the elephant in the room. And it's the truth. Like, in the end, if you're a campaigner for more foreign assistance from the US government, you spend a lot of time in the halls of Congress. And part of the argument you have to make is, listen, Senator, money is going to go to the university in your state, or Congressman, money is going to go to the NGO headquartered in your district. And those things really do matter. They're not inconsequential in making the overall case. So I think we have to have a balanced conversation where we understand what the different objectives are. And they are sometimes, at least somewhat, at cross purposes.
Yeah. No, that's honest. That's honest. And I would even say, in addition to that, then you really have you can then really come together and have an honest discussion about all these reforms that we want to come out of the sector, and especially those around climate, around financing the SDGs, which take all of us to think about it and often take a less than domestic interest approach. These genuine last reforms that we want, they can be circumvented with all these changes that are happening in terms of directing aid and aid dollars and aid resources. It's imbalance. That's period.
This makes me think of another piece in our newswire this week. David, you were murdering the French. Maybe you can take a shot at murdering the Dutch, or maybe you're better. Because the Netherlands has a new minister for foreign trade and development cooperation. And this new minister is a fascinating case study in what I was just describing about these kind of multiple objectives, because this is someone who has basically said there should be no aid. She's called for a complete stop to development assistance, but now is in a government that doesn't have that extreme policy. It does have a policy that's cutting aid, but it's not quite so extreme. I don't know, David, maybe tell people a little bit of what we wrote about.
Yes, I don't think I'm even gonna try with the Dutch, although it often sounds like English, but with extra ease, I think. Yeah, I mean, this is a trend we've seen in quite a few Northern European governments recently, is a much more right-wing, anti-aid kind of leadership coming in, kind of wanting to impose cuts, trying to shift how aid is given away. I mean, this individual, Rennet Klaver, really murdering that one, Rennet Klaver, is... has said that climate change is a hoax and asylum seekers bring exotic diseases with them. Some quite outlandish claims. And she's not. I think she herself has said I would get rid of aid altogether, but obviously she's working within a coalition and has had to temper that kind of approach, and is still obviously working for a very different approach to aid than the one that people are used to. But and a number of governments have done this. Have said we're taking a more instrumentalist approach to aid. We're making some top line cuts. We're particularly worried about immigration, and we're going to tackle the things that we care about at home. We're going to adopt more of a trade for aid approach. All of these things, like obviously, this lady in particular is concerning. There's a quote from Oxfam here. Oxfam program director Pepin Garrett said that her past comments were cause for concern, like a wolf being asked to watch a flock of sheep. So I think it's obviously a worry what's happening in Northern Europe. There's a number of aid ministers who are taking this approach now, and it's got to be a concern for the community, particularly given that these are traditionally some of the most generous pro-aid countries in the world.
Yeah, I think two thoughts from this really quickly. One is, look, if you have a conversation about localization, which was very much happening in our space, we can't divorce it from the political conversations happening in global North countries, because there's a real danger that if it gets too separate from those conversations, we're just living in kind of a la-la land, and in the end, we may end up with, like what the Netherlands is facing, a very different political reality. And the second is, if you want to try to mispronounce some Dutch words on your own, there is a pro story that is all about the backstory of what's happening in the Netherlands and all the cuts that are coming and what's coming next. So have a look at that if you want to pay a little more attention to what's going on in the Netherlands market. But go ahead, Nasra.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say this shift, we've been seeing it for the last 5-6 years. I think there is real concern because it's also not, these shifts in terms of right-wing philosophies and what they mean and the real impact that they will have on the ground with support for climate and emergency work and crisis conflict interventions that are so dire and that actually impact everyone, not just the place that they are placed in. But I just remember 3-4 years ago, Netherlands was one of the leaders of the Grand Bargain, one of the leaders of a lot of the work around gender equity, particularly in places that where there are no other major donor present. And so I think this is such a huge loss for the time being. It's not just a political shift; it has real ramifications for those who rely on Dutch funding, Dutch expertise, and Dutch collaboration. And so I'm actually really terrified of these kinds of trends because of all the sectors, they have a real impact immediately on our communities that are on the forefront. So I'm glad somebody's watching and keeping an eye on this because I'm afraid we'll see more and more.
Yeah, I think we might. And just as we wrap up here, we've talked a little bit about Pro Week. One of the special events that we've got on Monday, which is on this theme that our Pro subscribers told us they want to hear more about, is the elections. And I'm going to be interviewing Ben Rhodes, who probably most listeners are familiar with, especially if you're in the U.S. He was really a right hand to President Barack Obama in the White House, a speechwriter, a deputy national security advisor, and he's a real leader in the Democratic Party on the left. When it comes to foreign policy. So right now, there's a lot of conversation that maybe there's going to be a Donald Trump second presidency, but that may not happen. We may end up with a Democrat in the White House, and we're going to explore, well, if it is Joe Biden or another Democrat, what does that mean for foreign assistance policy? What does that mean for international development and cooperation, given just where politics has shifted in the United States? So we're going to have a really fascinating conversation, I think, about the implications of the election, however it comes out on Monday. So if you're a Pro member, you should absolutely tune into that, listen in for the live event, or join the recording afterwards. That'll be available to all pros. If you're not yet a Pro, maybe, David, you could just tell people a little bit about what they should do for Pro Week.
Well, you should sign up immediately to become a DevEx Pro. It gives you all sorts of great insight into what's going on in the world of aid. But
one thing worth mentioning is just if you're not sure what this thing is and if it's worth it, there is a 15-day free trial. So you can sign up, you can check it out. You'll see a little bit more about what Dave and I are talking about, get a sense for the content that you get, and make a decision.
Yes, absolutely. Come onto our site, go onto our events page, take a look at all the events, see if there's anything that takes your fancy. We're also producing 2 special reports, one which is a report on all of the top INGOs in the United States, how much funding they get, where they get it from. You can look at which ones are kind of going up, going down. And we'll also have a report on where ODA is spent as well, which will give people some some insight into kind of who's giving money where. It's very interesting to see the different countries that are receiving different amounts of money and how differently the different big donors fund around the world. And you'll be able to go onto our reports page and check those out, take a look, see if they take your fancy. And if you click on those and you want to download them, then you'll be able again to click on the link and sign up to Pro. It's very easy to sign up to Pro. You go onto our homepage. There's a link there that shows you how to do it. And as Raj said, you can do it either monthly or you can do it annually. And if you're not sure, then sign up for a 15-day free trial and see if you like what you see.
And if you are a Pro subscriber, reach out to us. Let us know what you think. What are you looking for? We really appreciate all of you who've written in and told us some of the content you're hoping to get during Pro Week. Check out Pro Week, see what you think, and let us know. We really appreciate you being a subscriber. This has, as always, been a fun half an hour to chat with my friends, David Ainsworth, Nasra Ismail. Thank you all for joining us for another episode of This Week in Global Development.
Thanks, Raj. Thanks, David.
Thanks to you both as well.
This has been This Week in Global Development. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe using the link in the description. To get even more coverage and analysis on the most pressing development issues of the day, become a DevX Pro member by going to devx.com/membership and signing up. Thank you for listening, and see you next week.